evening, everyone. My name is Mike Jorgensen. I am the Adult Services Librarian here at the Coralville Public Library. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Monica, for coming to share what, as you said, a quarter of this is just a quarter.
Actually, this is less than a quarter of my collection. I've accumulated a lot of stuff over the last 25 years.
Monica is the president of the Younger Stamfords of Iowa City, also a member of a number of other Sherlockian organizations, including the Hounds of the Baskerville, the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, and the John H. Watson Society.
Yes.
And just a couple of notes. If you don't know where the restrooms are, they're outside the door and to the left. Feel free to take a break if you need to. And I would say feel free to grab snacks, but they're just about gone. But feel free to scavenge. There's still some tea and some lemonade over there. And the last thing is we have a number of items related to Sherlock Holmes that are available to check out here at the library. They're on the back table behind the gentleman from Prohibition with the camera. Feel free to take those upstairs and check them out. And I know I said that was the last thing, but then I thought of one other thing, and that is on Thursday we're going to have a movie here, Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law, Rachel McAdams, which is one of many iterations of Sherlock Holmes, which is what Marshall will be talking about tonight. So I'll let her go. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you. Here dwell together still two men of note, who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote, that age before the world went all awry. Yet the game's still afoot for those with ears, attuned to catch the distant view, halloo. England is England, yet for all of our fears, only the things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive, and it is always 1895. These immortal words of the sonnets written by original BSI or Baker Street Regulars member Vincent Sterrett in 1942 during the London bombing brings together the idea that Holmes and Watson, these two men of note, have never lived and so can never die. So it brings forth the idea that these gentlemen, even during the bombing of London, still captured the imagination of the populace. Now, over the last 70-odd years since then, we have had many different iterations of Sherlock Holmes. And so tonight's lecture is looking at the various incarnations of Sherlock Holmes, the interplay between the pop culture idea of who is this gentleman and the actual, or what is actually in the literature. So will the real Sherlock Holmes please stand up, or Sherlock Holmes isn't who you think he is. So forgive me, guys, we have a ton of film clips, and some of them are a little long, so I apologize for the long clips, but I promise you they're worth it. Oh.
What is it tonight? Morphine or cocaine?
Well, I can strongly recommend a 7% solution of cocaine. Would you care to try it?
No, indeed. I speak not only as your friend, but as a medical man. How can you risk such damage to the great powers with which you have been endowed?
I cannot tell you how it clarifies and stimulates the mind.
Yes, and destroys it in time.
My mind rebels at stagnation.
Give me problems, give me work.
Give me the most abstruse cryptogram, the most intricate analysis, and I will
my own proper atmosphere. Then I can dispense with artificial stimulation.
But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave mental exaltation. That is why I've chosen my own profession, or rather, created it, for I am the only one in the world.
The only unofficial detective.
The only unofficial consulting detective. I take no credit in my cases.
I am the last and highest court of appeal in detection. When the official police are out of their depth, the matter is laid before me. I examine all the data and pronounce a specialist opinion. I claim no credit. The work
itself, the pleasure of finding a field for my particular powers is my highest reward.
You think me impertinent if I were to put your
Pay
theory
attention
the
to this
test?
watch.
On the contrary, I shall be delighted.
This watch has recently come into my possession. Perhaps you'll give me your opinion as to the character and habits of the late owner.
It's difficult for a man to have any object in daily use and not leave the impress of his individuality on it. But this watch has recently been cleaned, which
Robs me of my most important facts.
You're right. It was cleaned before it came into my possession. That is, however, a most lame and impotent excuse to cover your failure.
I make no excuse. This is a 50-guinea watch, hence it belonged to...
Ваш брат был беспорядочный и легкомысленный человек. Пьяница.
Yes, that's Russian.
Он получил хорошее наследство.
Soviet Russian, in fact.
Но быстро все промотал и жил в бедности. Правда, иногда ему улыбалась фортуна. В конце концов он спился и умер. Вот все.
The watch, in fact, belonged to your elder brother.
That's unworthy of you, Holmes. You've obviously learned the history of my unhappy brother. You can't expect me to believe you gathered all that from his old watch.
My dear fellow, I'm sorry.
Уверяю вас, мне все сказали часы. Ватсон, я просто скрыл от вас логическую цепь рассуждений и предложил вам только выводы. От этого вы мне не верите. Ну, прошу вас, увидитесь сами.
I began by stating that your brother was careless. Look at the lower part of that watch case. It's cut and marked all over from the habit of keeping other
Hard objects such as coins and keys kept in the same pocket. Only a careless, untidy man treats an expensive article in such a fashion.
Нацарапанной иголкой. Видите? Знаете, что это такое? Это номера квитанций. Так делают во всех английских ломбардах во избежание путаницы.
There are no fewer than 4 such numbers visible to my lens there. Inference, your brother was often at low water, but he had occasional bursts of prosperity, or he could not have redeemed his watch. Now look, the back plate.
Scratches around the keyhole where the watch is wound. What is that?
По утрам у вашего брата тряслись руки, что бывает только с очень пьющими.
The drunkard's watch without them.
He leaves traces of his unsteady hand.
Lastly, you said the watch had come into your possession, meaning you did not buy it. The initials HW on the back suggest your family name.
Давно умер, а часы, как я вам сказал, у меня только год. Значит, мой отец оставил их по традиции старшему сыну, а он передал их мне.
Brother, where's the mystery in all this?
Where is the mystery in all this, my friend?
You know, Holmes, by now I should have more faith in your amazing faculties.
Every problem is absurdly simple when it is explained to you.
Okay. So one really cold and dreary January, I put all that stuff together. Actually, I created that mashup video because I realized that that scene is almost verbatim from the first chapter of the Sherlock Holmes story, The Sign of Four. And it's been done over and over and over and over again. So all of those illustrate the idea that the pop culture Sherlock Holmes is this guy who is square-jawed, well-off, middle-aged, stuffy do-gooder who lives with an elderly yet slightly befuddled roommate in a quaint London apartment. This Holmes is stern, cold, scientific, and humorless. Always running around in an Inverness cloak and a deerstalker cap, right? So this basically this guy. Or this guy. Now remember that watch scene?
Okay, you've got questions.
Where are we going?
Crime scene. There's been a murder. Next.
Who are you? What do you do?
What do you think?
I'd say private detective, but...
But?
The police don't go to private detectives.
I'm a consulting detective. I'm the only one in the world. I invented the job.
What does that mean?
Means when the police are out of their depth, which is always they consult me.
The police don't consult amateurs.
When I met you for the first time yesterday and asked Afghanistan or Iraq, you looked surprised.
How did you know?
I didn't know, I saw. Thank you. Tan face, but no tan above the wrists. You've been abroad, but not sunbathing. Your haircut and the way you hold yourself says military. Your conversation when you entered the room...
a bit different from my day.
Says trained at Bart, so army doctor, obvious. Your limp's really bad when you walk, but you don't ask for a chair when you stand, like you've forgotten about it. That means the limp is at least partly psychosomatic. That says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatizing. Wounded in action, then. So, where does an army doctor get himself a suntan and wounded in action these days? Afghanistan or Iraq?
You said I had a therapist.
Got a psychosomatic limp. Of course, you've got a therapist. And there's your brother.
Here, use mine.
Thank you. Your phone. This expensive email-enabled MP3 player. You're looking for a flat show. You wouldn't waste money on this. It's a gift, then. Scratches, not just one, but many over time. It's been in the same pocket as keys and coins. The man sitting beside me wouldn't treat it as one luxury item like this. It's had a previous owner, then. The next bit's easy. You know it already.
The engraving.
Harry Watson, clearly a family member who's given you his old phone. Not your father, this is a young man's gadget. Could be a cousin, but then you're a war hero returning home who can't find a place to live. Unlikely you've got an extended family, certainly not one you're close to. So, brother it is. Now, Clara. Who's Clara? 3 kisses, says it's a romantic attachment. Dispenser the phone says wife, not girlfriend. She's given this to him recently. The model's only 6 months old, so it's a marriage in trouble then. 6 months on, he's just giving it away. If she'd left him, he'd have kept the phone, probably. People do, sentiment. But no, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you. That says he wants you to stay in touch. He's worried about you. You're looking for cheap accommodation, but you won't go to your brother for help. That says you've got problems with him. Maybe you liked his wife. Maybe you don't like his drinking.
Yeah, how can you possibly know about the drinking?
Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Thank you. Power connection. Tiny scuff marks around the edge of it. Every night he plugs it in to recharge, but his hands are shaking. You never see those marks on a sober man's phone. Never see a drunk's without them.
Heard that line before, didn't you?
So you see, you were right.
I was right. Right about what?
The police don't consult amateurs.
That was amazing.
Do you think so?
Of course it was. It's extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary.
What people usually say.
What do they usually say?
Piss off.
So does he look like that or does he look like this? Of course, these are the modern iterations of Sherlock Holmes. You've got Benedict Cumberbatch, Johnny Lee Miller on CBS's Elementary, and then, of course, the Robert Downey Jr. ones, which spawned movies in 2009, 2011, and thankfully they're coming back with a third that they're going to be filming, hopefully, later next year. So what I want to do is take a look at the modern adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. So what we have is Sherlock Holmes as kind of an overgrown frat boy. We have this in the Robert Downey Jr. movies. He's the guy who lives in the slovenly in his apartment. The only thing that you're missing when you take a look at the Robert Downey Jr. movies is the pizza boxes stacked on the floor. He is, according to Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes, a high-functioning sociopath. So somebody completely and totally without empathy. Maybe he's got Asperger's. There have been a lot of people who have theorized that either because of the attention to detail of the Robert Downey Jr., the Johnny Lee Miller, or the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes or TV shows, that Holmes, his attention to detail and his complete and lack of utter social graces, he has Asperger's syndrome. Of course, he has a wicked, wicked sense of humor, sharp wit, incredibly self-centered. I think you could tell that just from the clips. Quick-minded, and definitely action hero and exciting. I mean, the way that these movies and TV shows are cut, Sherlock Holmes is like James Bond, just maybe not quite with all the gadgetry and funding from MI6. And of course, nowadays he's kind of got that romantic thing going on with Watson. Gone are the days that men could be good friends without being romantically involved, or at least accused of being romantically involved. So the question is, which one of these is Sherlock Holmes? The idea of the stiff upper lip Brit in the Deerstalker and Inverness Cloak, or those guys? Much like most of life, the truth lies a little somewhere in the middle. One of the cool things about Sherlock Holmes is that the character within the story is written by original author Arthur Conan Doyle, or I should say Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or as all of us now call him, ACD, just because a fewer syllables. So in the stories by ACD, Sherlock Holmes could blend with all classes of folk. He actually came from kind of upper middle class background, country squires. But he could very easily blend in disguise with the homeless or with the upper crust. He hung out with kings and queens, but he was equally at home with the guys smoking opium in the opium dens. He always dressed properly for the occasions. So when he was lounging around his Baker Street house, or a Baker Street flat, I should say, he was wearing a dressing gown, which is a really fancy, bathrobe. So think of it like the smoking jacket of, Hugh Hefner, but a little classier and maybe not quite so skeezy Hugh. So he wore a dressing gown, which was considered to be an early signifier of who Sherlock Holmes was. In the earliest versions of the Sherlock Holmes movies, you see a guy walking around his apartment in a dressing gown. That's Sherlock Holmes. It was not synonymous with this deerstalker that we were wearing. So when, I was going to say, he has a brilliant mind with an IQ that is off the charts. So in any TV show, you can basically take somebody who is ridiculously quick-witted, high IQ, smart, and maybe just a little bit off-putting, and call him Sherlock Holmes, and you probably could get away with some of that. He also has many action hero traits, including being able to do a little bit of fighting, single stick. So the cool thing is that Sherlock Holmes really is an archetype. He's somebody he's whoever you want him to be, as long as he has some of those accepted traits, or as I'm going to refer to them as signifiers throughout this presentation. So the literary Holmes. In the beginning, the first story published in December of 1887 in the Beaton's Christmas Annual, A Study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes is young. Both Holmes and Watson are in their 20s in A Study in Scarlet. This one, if anybody's seen the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., if they've seen Agent Carter, you should recognize this fella. That's Jarvis from Agent Carter. Actor James D'Arcy played a very young Sherlock Holmes in a late 90s production. But Holmes and Watson are young and poor. We always think of them as kind of semi-upper class Brits, but Watson's coming back from the war in Afghanistan. He's in London. He can't afford to live in a flat on his own. He needs a roommate. He runs into this guy by the name of Stamford that he knew from medical school. They go out for a beer, and Stamford says, well, it's really funny you should say that, Watson, because I know a guy who's also too poor to live on his own, who's looking for a roommate. Meet cute Watson and Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock Holmes is odd and untidy. He does have that bohemian lifestyle. So the idea of the Robert Downey Jr. movies, where he's kind of living in a little bit of squalor, is pretty correct. He has chemical experiments and an entire chemical lab in his flat in Baker Street. He's up all night smoking his pipe. There's a very classic phrase from the Sherlock Holmes story, The Red-Headed League, that refers to the idea of a three-pipe problem, that it's a problem that is so complex that it requires the smoking of not one, not two, but 3 pipes in order to kind of ponder and figure out. Maybe a little ADHD, maybe a little bipolar, at least by modern diagnostic standards. My day job is that I'm a substance abuse counselor at Prelude Behavioral Services in Iowa City. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and one of the fun things I do on the side, just because it's fun to be an armchair clinician, is to go through the Sherlock Holmes stories and see if he fits any of the diagnostic criteria for any mental health disorders. I have a couple of papers coming out soon. All right, Sherlock Holmes of the literature is musical and talented. He is a master of the violin, but he's also a bare-knuckled boxer and an excellent fencer. So the idea of Robert Downey Jr. stripping down to shirtless and doing some bare-knuckle boxing in the first Sherlock Holmes movie in 2009, okay, maybe the shirtless part is a little bit of a stretch, but the boxing, on the other hand, not a stretch whatsoever. Now, of course, Holmes was a fashionable fellow. He would wear a top hat and a frock coat in London town and a dressing gown around his flat. So this is a guy who was pretty attuned to the fashion of his day. Now, he would wear a cloth cap in the country. Cloth cap. This is what most people think of the idea of a cloth cap, a deerstalker cap. Never once was the word or the phrase deerstalker cap written in any of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Oh yeah, and as we found out from that opening clip, he was a drug abuser. He used cocaine and morphine, which were available in that day. They were considered to be kind of, the modern drugs, the modern cure-all drugs. So it was no big deal back then for him to be using cocaine or morphine intravenously. Now, of course, as you also heard from the clip, Watson wasn't exactly too keen on this, which is a very, very forward type of thinking for that era. It was something that kind of stood out of place. So the cool thing is that T.S. Eliot, that really famous poet, T.S. Eliot, has famous quotes regarding Sherlock Holmes that it's very difficult to not slip into the myth of his existence. In other words, it's really hard to kind of pull the fantasy from the reality. And this is one of the reasons why people sometimes forget that Sherlock Holmes, even though as a Sherlockian, I like to pretend that he's real because it's part of the fun of playing the game, so to speak, he was a fictional character. But one of the reasons why there is such difficulty in the idea of the pop culture consciousness that Sherlock Holmes wasn't real is because there's so much evidence that he was. Scholars write papers about him as if he were real. I mentioned my own academic papers having written and analyzed the characters. Literary societies, like the younger Stamfords that I now run, the Baker Street Irregulars, the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, have been playing the game, pretending that Sherlock Holmes was real and kind of having discussions about what if. Since 1934, we are the oldest fandom. We are awesome. We've been doing this for 83 years. Yay! Or it'll be 83 years next year. I was going to say, so we got some clout when it comes to that. Now, also, we inspire the pros. Now, the Sherlock Holmes stories, all 60 of them, when you combine them together, are referred to as the canon, or kind of the Bible. We refer to them as the canon. The canon is required reading for Scotland Yard detectives when they're taking their detectives exam, because there is so much early forensic science in the stories. There are college courses on criminology, including one that I took at Mount Mercy University back in 1999 when I was a student there, that mentioned Sherlock Holmes and his methods. There's also statues and historical commemorative plaques in at least 6 cities across the world. If evidence is indication that someone was real, we got a whole heck of a lot of evidence that Sherlock Holmes actually existed, even though he only existed in the pages. So, who is Mr. Sherlock Holmes? So, the problem is that unlike J.K. Rowling, Arthur Conan Doyle did not set out to write an epic series of stories. J.K. Rowling, when she wrote the Harry Potter series, had an outline. She had an idea. She had an overall story arc that she wanted to follow, and she had plans for each of her characters, completely mapped out. Arthur Conan Doyle started writing these stories because he didn't have a lot of patients at his medical practice, and he was bored. And so as a result of that, there's a lot of inconsistencies over the 40 years that he wrote the 60 stories. So some stories, timelines conflict with other stories' timelines, and it kind of creates a mess. But for me, as a Sherlockian, as a scholar, this is the area where we get to play. So from all the contextual clues within the stories, we have discovered that Sherlock Holmes was born on January 6th, 1854. He was the second son of a country squire, which would basically be the upper class country folk. His elder brother Mycroft was much older and much, much more talented, but less active. He went to public school, which when you're translating into American English is private school, for 2 years, and he attended Oxford or Cambridge, but only for 2 years. Holmes, in the first story, A Study in Scarlet, lists his limits in terms of what his knowledge is. He has the profound knowledge of chemistry, of British law, an immense knowledge of sensational literature. This is a guy that in the modern era would be reading the National Enquirer. And of course, he's an athlete, single stick boxing, fencing. And he's not exactly the type of guy that has a large circle of friends. He's got a lot of acquaintances, a lot of social contacts, but he doesn't let a lot of people in. Now, taking Holmes, basically Holmes on Holmes, we have quotes that Holmes saw himself as a perfect reasoning machine. My mind is like an engine tearing itself to pieces, from The Adventure of the Man with the Twisted Lip. I am a brain, Watson. The rest of me is a mere appendix, from The Mazarin Stone. He saw himself as a little antisocial and kind of misogynistic, so not exactly a friend to us ladies. I do not encourage visitors from the 5 Orange Pips, and women are never to be trusted, not even the best of them from the Sign of 4. Which is pretty standard for a Victorian gent, you know, so we gotta understand within the context of the era in which it was written, he wasn't exactly too keen on the ladies. And of course, he had idleness, a lot of moody, short-tempered, depressed, and an indulgence on drugs. So cocaine, morphine are mentioned in a study, or in the Sign of 4, and in different cases, he of course used opium, which again was legal, and then tobacco, but in ridiculously large amounts. There would be a fog of tobacco in the flat in Baker Street. So continuing on with the quotes, Sherlock Holmes saw himself as a little bit of a drama queen and a master of disguise. I can never resist the touch of the dramatic, he says in the Naval Treaty, as he reveals himself after taking off a disguise. And he answers to his own moral and ethical code. In The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, he actually lets the criminal, even though he caught the criminal red-handed, he lets him off the hook because it's Christmas and because Holmes basically decided in his own ethos that no good would come by throwing this guy in prison. And in The Final Problem, which would be the 25th Sherlock Holmes story, the one where Doyle kind of got sick of him and threw him off the Reichenbach Falls, as depicted in this picture right here. Holmes basically reflects back is that I think that I may go so far to say, Watson, that I had not lived wholly in vain. The air of London is sweeter for my presence. In over 1,000 cases, I am not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side. Basically saying that he used his powers for justice, even if he didn't necessarily follow the correct letter of the law. And of course, as much as everybody wants to romanticize Holmes, I have never loved Watson from the Devil's Foot. A lot of people like to bring in the character of Irene Adler, the primary female antagonist for Sherlock Holmes, as a possible love interest or entanglement. To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman. Actually is on the inside of my husband's wedding band. And another quote from the Scandal in Bohemia, in his eyes, she eclipses the whole of her sex. Also talking about Irene Adler, is on the inside of mine. Even though, for me, that smacks of romance, for Sherlock Holmes, that was platonic love and respect for Irene Adler. But, on the other hand, maybe Watson. There's a love there for Watson. Now, the thing is, though, is, as I said, in 2016, everybody assumes that guys that are close are gay. And there's, as I say, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. It's, as I say, under the circumstances, within the context of which these stories were written, it was Victorian London. Close male friendships were normal. They were par for the course. And even though there definitely was a homosexual activity, there was, I was going to say Oscar Wilde was thrown in prison because he was gay. More likely than not, Holmes and Watson, especially since Watson, when we get to him, we'll be talking about some of Watson's traits. Watson doesn't quite fit the prototypical potential lover for Sherlock Holmes, or Holmes, rather, does not fit the prototypical potential lover for Watson. So within Sherlock Holmes's professional life, early in his career, cases were scarce. He was living by his wits, occasionally consulted by Scotland Yard, but working mostly for the common folk. As his reputation and caseload grew and Watson became his biographer and started publishing the stories, Scotland Yard came a little bit more often. He was basically viewed as a brilliant nuisance to the Scotland Yard detectives. By the middle of the career, he was kind of the London celebrity status, commissioned by the upper crust of British society, the King of Bohemia, the French and British governments, and even the Pope. Yes, the Pope. Now, he defied death. As I mentioned before, Arthur Conan Doyle, the author, got sick of Sherlock Holmes and decided to lob him off the Reichenbach Falls in The Final Problem. After 10 years of harassment by fans, including Queen Victoria herself, he finally relented and gave in and brought Sherlock Holmes back in the story The Hound of the Baskervilles, which he set prior to lobbing him off the cliff. And then the Hound was so successful that he just decided to give in and resurrect Holmes. So he returned for 35 more documented cases and hundreds of undocumented cases. And he retired in 1914 to Sussex to be a beekeeper, which is where some authors pick up. Anybody who's read the Laurie R. King's Mary Russell series, the Beekeeper's Apprentice series, that's exactly where that series starts. So let's talk about Dr. John Watson, the great detective's Boswell or biographer. So Watson, thin as a lath and brown as a nut. He is usually described as strongly built of stature, either average or slightly above average, with a thick, strong neck and a small mustache. So when looking at Jude Law or looking at Nigel Bruce, who does that describe? We're looking at Jude Law. Now, Watson is also listed as being an athlete. He played rugby for Blackheath, which was a very formidable team in its era. Jude Law, yet again. Oh, and he earned the Doctorate of Medicine from the University of London in 1878, which basically pits him as being 2 years older than Sherlock Holmes. Again, not the old doddering fool that a lot of people think Watson was. So he's late in the British Army. He fought in the War of Afghanistan. Now, the one thing that has been, as I mentioned, since Arthur Conan Doyle didn't really keep track of all the minor details, one of the fun areas that we Sherlockians get to play in is whether Watson was shot in the shoulder or the leg, because in different stories, his wound appears in different spots. I wrote a very fun toast to the type of bullet that pierced him, the Giselle bullet, and I tracked its trajectory through the various tissues. And thanks to the tutelage of younger Stamfords founder, Dr. Richard Kaplan, who was professor of dermatology at the University of Iowa, I was able to keep my description vague enough that it could have either been a shoulder or a leg. Now, Watson, of course, being an Army doctor, had to go through Army training, and he's a crack shot with a pistol, which of course would be a skill that would come in handy during the various adventures. Holmes didn't really carry weapons, he didn't carry a gun. Watson, on the other hand, did. And here we go, Watson was a womanizer. Every time I just automatically think of the Britney Spears song, Womanizer. So Watson in the stories had lovers from not one, not two, but 3 continents. He was once, twice, thrice, possibly even 6 times married, depending on how one wants to follow the chronology of the stories. The fairer sex is your department, Watson, Holmes utters in the story of the Second Stain. So Watson was a hit with the ladies man. So, under the circumstances, maybe he did have Holmes on the side. Who knows? But Watson might have been just a little bit too busy between the possible 6 marriages and the various lovers to have time for Holmes. Now, Watson's function within the stories is to serve as a catalyst for Holmes's mental process. Those who do not possess genius often inspire it in others. He's the archetype for the sidekick and the biographer. I am lost without my Boswell, Sherlock Holmes utters. Now, of course, you have your very famous sidekicks. You've got Batman, Robin. First and foremost, Sherlock Holmes and Watson. And of course, Watson, even though he is an Army doctor, a man of above average intelligence, because you need to be in order to be a doctor, compared to Holmes, he was looked of average intelligence. So he basically provided the every guy perspective through which to tell the story. So the readers can relate to Watson a heck of a lot easier than they can relate to Sherlock Holmes. And so as you're reading the stories from Watson's perspective, you're kind of following along through his eyes. So why am I giving you all this background information? What I want to do is I wanted to differentiate between the textual idea of Sherlock Holmes and pop culture. The pop culture influence is now what we view as the Sherlockian signifier. As I mentioned before, the deerstalker cap and the Inverness cloak were never written in the stories themselves. They originally appear in an illustration by Sidney Paget, and only one illustration. There were at least a dozen different illustrators over the original run of the Sherlock Holmes stories. One illustration, one iconic view. Resonates for over 100 years. The meerschaum, the calabash pipe that my friend Dave over there happens to have a big one of. I was going to say that big curved pipe is there is not mentioned in one single story. There are a lot of pipes that are mentioned. Most of them are straight, some of them are clay, some of them are red, but never the big calabash or meerschaum pipe. And the reason why that's part of the pop culture kind of consciousness when it comes to Sherlock Holmes is because of an actor from 1899, a gentleman by the name of William Gillette, who wrote a play on Sherlock Holmes. And he performed it all around the world, performing it over 1,300 times between America, England, and the continental Europe. And in 1916, he shot a film adaptation of that same play at Chicago's S&A Studios. Now, that film was lost to time, and it was recently found 2 years ago in the basement of the Cinémathèque Française. It's like finding the Holy Grail for Sherlock Holmes fans, because for 80 years, nobody had seen this film. And all of a sudden, boom, it's available on Blu-ray. Buy it now. But so you can check out the original incarnation of where the audience got the idea of the big pipe. And that old, fat, stupid, doddering Watson comes from Nigel Bruce from the Basil Rathbone series from the 1930s and 1940s. So, of course, there's been many recent TV derivatives of Sherlock Holmes. There's the really recent series, Houdini and Doyle, which basically takes Arthur Conan Doyle and kind of melds him together with his own detective and plays with the idea of Arthur Conan Doyle as a spiritualist and Houdini as a skeptic. So kind of X-Files minus the supernatural element, but some degree of supernatural elements with a little Sherlock Holmes mixed in. Reasonably successful miniseries on Fox that just finished up. There was the CSI Effect. The main character, Grissom, is pretty much a Sherlock Holmes derivative. And House. Sounds like Holmes. Lived at 221B Baker Street. Had a best friend with the initials JW, James Wilson, John Watson. Played the piano versus played the violin. Had an opiate addiction for Vicodin versus the cocaine addiction. Are we seeing the parallels here? Yeah. And of course, when it comes to Sherlock Holmes movies and stories, they kind of defy the traditional literary adaptation. So your standard, when people are thinking about a book that they want adapted into a movie, they usually want it to be just like the stories, right? One of the biggest complaints about the Lord of the Rings adaptations is it's not enough of the stories in it, man. But when it comes to Sherlock Holmes stories, usually it's a subplot from here, a character from this story, a quote from that story, a reference from that one. You pop all that into a blender, throw in a lot of originality and whirl. So it's a kind of a blender effect rather than a straightforward literary adaptation. And so in order to understand what Sherlock Holmes is, you need to understand all that is about Sherlock Holmes. So now we get to the point where we get to start analyzing a lot of film clips and looking for Sherlockian signifiers. So now are the many faces and different interpretations of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson. The first clip that we're going to be watching is from the my personal favorite version of Sherlock Holmes, the Jeremy Brett or Granada series. This is from the episode The Second Stain. We're going to be watching a clip. Now, if you guys had the story of The Second Stain in front of you, you can follow along almost word for word. This is probably, out of the entire series, the most straightforward adapted version of this story. As I said, you can follow along word for word. It's kind of insane.
Now I will show you the explanation. There is a second stain, but it does not correspond with this one. Dr. Watson, will you take that side of the carpet? Now we will move round in an anti-clockwise direction. What I want to know is, Mr. Holmes, who shifted the carpet? Why?
Lestrade, who was on duty the day after the murder?
The day after. Macpherson. He's out there now.
Take my advice, examine him carefully.
I'll get him.
Don't do it before us. We'll wait here. Tell Tell him you know someone has been here. Press him. Tell him a full confession is his only chance of forgiveness. Do exactly as I tell you.
But, George, if he knows, I'll have it out of him.
Watson, quick, the tape.
Holmes! Never heard such a thing in all my years in the force. And another thing. In here, Constable.
Macpherson, how's the family?
Very well, thank you, sir.
Well, come on out with it. Let these gentlemen hear of your inexcusable conduct.
Well, I meant no harm, sir, I'm sure. This young woman came to the door answering an advertisement about typewriting. She mistook the house, she said. Well, we got talking, sir. You know how it is. It's a bit lonely when you're out there on duty all day.
What happened, Macpherson?
Well, sir, we got talking about the crime. She had read about it in the paper, she said, and wanted to see what it was done. So I saw no harm in letting her have a wee keek. She got just about in the door there, spotted that mark in the carpet, and down she dropped on the floor and lay for dead.
And no wonder.
Go on, Macpherson.
Well, sir, I was away around at the ivy plant for some brandy, and by the time I had brought it back, the young woman had... Well, she wasn't here anymore. She had recovered and was off. Ashamed of herself as like as not, and dared not face me.
Macpherson, did you move the carpet?
No, sir, I only straightened it out. You see, she'd fell on it, and the polished floor being slippery.
Let that be a lesson to you, Constable, that you can't deceive me. No doubt you thought your breach of duty would never be discovered. Yet a mere glance at that carpet was enough to convince me that someone had been admitted to this room. Lucky for you, my man, that nothing's missing. Otherwise, you'd find yourself in Queer Street.
That's
That'll do.
in Victorian London. Queer Street basically was based up the river, so to speak. Victorian slang and modern slang don't always work. But you get the basic idea. You've got Lestrade taking credit for Holmes's intelligence and observations. But as I said, this is the most straightforward literary adaptation of the canon to date, this series. It's almost word for word, and it's extremely accurate, although by 2016 standards, the pacing might be a little flat. I love this series. I grew up watching this series, but as I said, even by my own particular standards, it's like, oh yeah, this moves at a much slower pace than to which I am accustomed. So you've got your Holmes and your Watson both properly attired for the city. Not a deerstalker among them. They're contemporaries, maybe a tad bit older than the text suggests, but they're at least within the same age range. There's not a really, really old Watson and a young Holmes. Holmes is theatrical, maybe a little manic, definitely over-intelligence, and a man of action, scrambling around on that floor looking for that secret compartment. Now Watson, on the other hand, man of intelligence, dutiful sidekick, as well as a man of action. He's a comrade befitting of the genius Holmes, and he looked and acted that he could have been realistically a doctor and a soldier once upon a time. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be seeing the oldest Sherlock Holmes film on record. This is a short film from 1900 called Sherlock Holmes Baffled. Now, remember I mentioned about the concept of the dressing gown? Well, see the dude in the dressing gown? Right there? So this is a short film from 1900 playing camera tricks. Kind of just looking around, playing camera tricks where the thief comes in and there's Holmes smoking a cigar and the thief appears. And then he shoots him and then the thief jumps away. And he's baffled. Where's the dude? And then the bag disappears. So at different, as I say, different places will rate this as either at 1900 or 1903. But it is the earliest cinematic portrayal of Sherlock Holmes. The motion pictures originated in 1878. The first Sherlock Holmes story came out in 1887, so when film was 9 years old, the first Sherlock Holmes story was published. It depicts an aloof Sherlock Holmes, so a parody of sorts. You know, your sharp detective's not so sharp in that tale. He's wearing a dressing gown, that signifier of Sherlock Holmes. Again, not a deerstalker in sight. And of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with any particular story. It's just a bunch of people having some fun at the expense of our great detective. Now, we're going to flash forward 70 years up to The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, directed by Billy Wilder in 1970. We're going to watch a clip. I'm going to actually cut the clip a little short just because it is a little long in the tooth. But you guys will get a pretty good idea of how 70 years difference transforms how the pop culture, or how the populace sees Sherlock Holmes.
I wish you'd give me a bit more warning when you come home unexpected. I'd have roasted a goose, had a few flowers for you.
My dear Mrs. Hudson, criminals are as unpredictable as head colds. You never quite know when you're going to catch one.
I'll unpack your bag.
Here's an advance copy of Strand magazine. They printed the Red-Headed League.
Very impressive.
Would you like to see how I've treated it?
I can hardly wait. I'm sure I shall find out all sorts of fascinating things about the case that I never knew before.
Just what do you mean by that?
Oh, come now, Watson. You must admit you have a tendency to over-romanticize. You've taken my simple exercises in logic and embellished them, embroidered them, exaggerated them.
I deny the accusation.
You have described me as 6'4", whereas I'm barely 6'1".
A bit of poetic license.
You saddled me with this improbable costume, which the public now expects me to wear.
That is not my doing. Blame it on the illustrator.
You've made me out to be a violin virtuoso. There's an invitation from the Liverpool Symphony to appear as soloist in the Mendelssohn Concerto.
Really?
The fact is, I could barely hold my own in the pit orchestra of a second-rate music hall.
You're much too modest.
You've given the reader the distinct impression that I'm a misogynist. Actually, I don't dislike women. I merely distrust them. The twinkle in the eye and the arsenic in the soup.
It's those little touches that make you colorful.
Lurid is more like it. You've painted me as a hopeless dope addict just because I occasionally take a 5% solution of cocaine.
A 7% solution?
5%. Don't you think I'm aware you've been diluting it behind my back?
As a doctor, as well as your friend, I strongly disapprove of this insidious habit of yours.
My dear friend, as well as my dear doctor, I only resort to narcotics when I'm suffering from acute boredom, when there are no interesting cases to engage my mind. Look at this. An urgent appeal to find some missing midgets.
Did you say midgets?
6 of them. The tumbling piccolos, an acrobatic act with some circus.
Disappeared between London and Bristol. Well, don't you find that intriguing?
Extremely so. You see, they are not only midgets, but also anarchists.
Anarchists?
By now, they have been smuggled to Vienna, dressed as little girls in organdy pinafores. They are to greet the Tsar of all the Russias when he arrives at the railway station. They will be carrying bouquets of flowers, and concealed in each bouquet will be a bomb with a lit fuse.
You really think so?
Not at all.
I love that clip. I could just watch the movie over and over and over. It's such a great film. All right, so in this particular version of the portrayal of Sherlock Holmes, you have Holmes in a very traditional pop culture costume, the Inverness cloak, the deerstalker cap, and it's even commenting on how absurd it is. That he's complaining of being made into a pop culture icon, and he's commenting and parroting on the absurdist plots of the canonical stories. When you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, it does require a significant amount of suspension of disbelief. They're fun stories, but they're not very realistic. And of course, actor Robert Stevens is portraying a very theatrical version of Sherlock Holmes, parading around the flat a little bit, with a little bit of a lisp and exaggerated movements. Actually, in this particular movie, he was actually playing with the idea that Holmes could have been gay. So, you know, which in this, one of the subplots in this particular movie is that Holmes pretends that he's Watson's lover in order to get out of a situation. So that's considered by Sherlockians to be sacrilege, but it's still a heck of a lot of fun in this movie. Okay, so this is one of my favorites. And as someone earlier mentioned, the 30th anniversary of the release of this film was just last week. This is one of my favorite clips from The Great Mouse Detective, the Disney masterpiece.
Is this the residence of Basil of Baker Street?
I'm afraid it is. He's not here at the moment, but you're welcome to come in and wait.
Oh, I don't want to impose. It's just the girl.
Oh, my. You poor dear. You must be chilled to the bone. Oh, but I know just the thing. Let me fetch you a pot of tea and some of my fresh cheese crumpets.
Slip this time. I shall have him! Out of my way! Out of my way!
I say, who are you?
What? Oh. Basil of Baker Street, my good fellow.
Mr. Basil, I need your help, and...
All in good time.
But you don't understand. I'm in terrible trouble.
If you'll excuse me.
No. Now, see here. This young lady is in need of assistance. I think you ought to listen.
Hold this, please, Doctor.
Of course. But,
good.
Now, wait just a moment. How the deuce did you know I was a doctor?
A surgeon, to be exact. Just returned from military duty in Afghanistan.
We've heard this before.
Am I right?
Yes. Major David Q. Dawson. But how could you possibly...
Quite simple, really. You've sewn your torn cuff together with a Lambert stitch, which, of course, only a surgeon uses. And the thread is a unique form of catgut, easily distinguished by its peculiar pungency, found only in the Afghan provinces.
Amazing.
Actually, it's elementary, my dear Dawson.
What in heaven's name? Oh! My good pillows! Mr. Basil! How many times have I told you not to...
Mrs. Judson, it's quite all right. I believe I smell some of those delightful cheese crumpets of yours. Why did you fetch our guests some?
But I...
Now.
Okay, so this is the introduction of Basil and Dawson, or Holmes and Watson, and Dawson is immediately brought in on the adventure, kind of like in the Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes story. Holmes is depicted initially in disguise, which is an often underutilized canonical reference. He's arrogant, egotistical, and definitely ignores the little girl and misogynistic. Manic, energetic Holmes who falls easily into depression. Later in the clip, as soon as he finds that the bullets that he was comparing don't match, his entire mood is deflated and he basically starts to play his violin all sad. So he's, of course, wearing traditional Sherlockian signifiers, that dressing gown, the pipes, the violin, the chemical experiments. And the plot of this story is completely original, but it does make references and borrows quotations from multiple stories. So again, a little bit from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from everywhere. Now, of course, there's a ton of animated versions of Sherlock Holmes, including one of my favorites with the most catchy theme song on the planet.
Sherlock Holmes. Bring Sherlock Holmes back to life. Back to life.
It's elementary, my dear Watson.
Sherlock Holmes in the 20th century. Sherlock Holmes.
And we're going to skip that because that's going to get really annoying after the next 30 seconds. Surprisingly enough, that series is fantastic in terms of adaptations. It takes Sherlock Holmes, who is brought back to life in the 22nd century, go fig by the title, but it does some really interesting adaptations and very straightforward adaptations of the original stories. I highly recommend you check it out. It's available on DVD. So continuing our exploration of Sherlock Holmes, we're going to be doing a clip from 1979's Murder by Decree. We're going to have Canadian actor Christopher Plummer playing Sherlock Holmes opposite classic British actor James Mason's Watson. This is a little bit different than what we've seen so far.
These damn newspapers.
I have the whole city in a blind state of panic. Last night, when we were examining the body of the unfortunate Catherine... Don't remind me of that, old chap. You notice a woman in the crowd? I noticed dozens of women. Well, yes, I would expect that of you, Watson. But one particular woman. Watson. Yes. Watson, what are you doing? I'm trying to corner the last pea on my plate. What's that object you're fooling around with? Oh, nothing. Yet. Yeah. But as I was saying, about the woman. I don't know how you can worry about some woman in a crowd when you're supposed to be conducting an investigation. Yeah. But there was a singularly haunting quality about her. Like some wild creature, cornered. You squashed my pea. Well, now you got it cornered. Yeah, but squashing a fellow's pea. I'm just trying to help. I didn't want it squashed. I don't like it that way. Squashed. I like it whole, so that you can feel it pop when you bite down on it. No, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. I'll get the door, old fellow.
A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. The boy didn't wait for an answer.
Oh, well, thank you, Mrs. And good night.
Good night, sir.
More from our anonymous advisor. He invites us to meet him at the Elizabeth Wharf. Oh, really? No good.
Okay. So Murder by Decree, of course, you have a younger Holmes, older Watson, and Watson, of course, has a degree of intelligence, but this has a ton of humor in it. There's loads of signifiers at Baker Street. You've got your chemical experiments, your violin, your pipe, and of course, references to Watson's womanizing, which of course in most adaptations tends to be left out. Holmes notices a haunting quality about the woman in the crowd, which is different than any Holmes before, because Holmes doesn't really pay attention to the ladies. There's a comfortable camaraderie between the two of them, a brotherly interaction between the two. Holmes sees the pea as a problem to be solved. The pea, from Watson's perspective, is to be enjoyed for the experience. So again, just kind of delineating the differences between these two illustrious roommates. Now, one of my absolute favorite versions of Sherlock Holmes is from 1985, A Young Sherlock Holmes. Now, this particular film clip is a little bit longer, but I want you guys to hang in here because Harry Potter fans in the room will start to recognize a lot of similarities in this clip between Harry Potter and this film that premiered 25 years before.
Going to solve the crime! Holmes is going to solve a crime!
What did he say? Holmes is going to solve the crime!
Did you hear? Holmes is going to run! You will eat that with me!
It was the beginning of my second week at Brompton. With each passing day, my fascination with Sherlock Holmes and his world continued to grow. On this occasion, the entire school was bursting with excitement. Dudley had challenged Holmes to a test of ingenuity, skill, and perception. Dudley had snatched the school's fencing trophy and hidden it in a secret place. He gave Holmes 60 minutes to find the trophy. Holmes accepted the challenge with confidence.
The game is afoot.
Good luck, Holmes. Good luck.
Truly despicable. Imagine a cultured student acting like a chimpanzee.
Now, Mr. Snowgrove, he's just having a bit of fun. I'm sure that you can still remember what fun was.
Fun? Besides, this Holmes boy is too precocious, too egotistical for his own good. He'll never find that trophy.
I'll wager a guinea he does.
Done.
Holmes, you've only got 1 minute. Holmes, you've only got 1 minute.
I heard you the first time, can't you see? I'm trying to concentrate.
Only seconds left, Holmes. I assume you're giving up?
Never assume anything, my good fellow.
But Holmes, I see no sign of a trophy.
But I do.
Stop! Holmes, have you gone mad? This is an antique.
Okay. So this particular movie looks at the non-canonical origins of the association of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson. There's lots of allusions to the stories. And there's actually a closing credits reference to the possible origins of Sherlock Holmes' arch nemesis, Moriarty. So this is one of those original stay after the end credits movies. Now in this particular one, you have a slightly older Holmes and a slightly younger Watson, but these guys are teens versus meeting in their early 20s. Holmes is young, but has his adult quick wit, sense of adventure, and his deductive reasoning skills. Watson is young, inexperienced, and a little naive, and still kind of pudgy. But as I said, Harry Potter? Did anybody get that feel from Harry Potter? The reason why there's a feel, a kind of an overall Harry Potter feel, is that the original screenwriter for the young Sherlock Holmes is Chris Columbus, who directed the first two and produced all 7 of the Harry Potter movies. So there's a reason why there's that overlap. Now, this next clip looks at a particular Sherlock Holmes movie. It's a shorter clip. This movie has a special place in my heart, even though the movie itself is not very good. When I was 5 years old, 5.5-year-old Monica saw this movie on a TV in January of 1987, forever capturing my imagination with Sherlock Holmes. So you guys get to see the movie, or at least a clip of a movie that turned me into a Sherlock Holmes enthusiast. Sherlock Holmes is cryogenically frozen and woken up in modern era.
Well, they were a lot neater at Watergate, huh? Who's your friend? Sherlock Holmes.
Delighted to meet you.
Cute. What do you make of this?
The stroke is unusually thick. This was written by a man who stands more than 6 feet tall, is of great strength, and probably weighs some 15 stone, more than 200 pounds. He's poor since he uses paper of the coarsest variety. He lives in Boston, in fact, in this very neighborhood, since the note is unfolded. And he wears a cheap cologne.
Holmes, that's absolutely incredible. It's incredible, all right.
Madam, you doubt my conclusions?
First of all, the police took the original note to analyze. I copied it down myself. I may be overweight, but I'm not 6 feet tall, and I'm not a man. The stroke is thick because I wrote it with a felt-tip pen, and the paper is coarse because you are holding a photocopy. And that cheap cologne is my perfume.
Oh.
Snap. So, this particular movie is a fish out of water tale. Sherlock Holmes was cryogenically frozen and woken up in 1987 in San Francisco by the great-great-granddaughter of John Watson, Joan Watson. Now, Watson is a woman, so those misogynistic feelings that Holmes had in the stories have to be left aside. Watson is a necessary guide to the modern world, so Holmes is very much a fish out of water story in this case. And Holmes is, unlike in every other clip we've seen, is dead wrong. He's unfamiliar with the modern technology, and as a result, his deductive reasoning has failed. So, of course, this particular film pulls plots from multiple different stories, as well as quotations from at least 3 more. So, as again, blender technique. Now, when we're talking in terms of adaptation and looking at who Sherlock Holmes is, sometimes we have to borrow from within film itself. So literature is not the only good source from which to pill for good ideas. So those of you guys who have seen the Robert Downey Jr. movie might recognize this opening sequence. Looks just like this one. But again, you guys can see the parallels. Or how about this sequence from the Robert Downey Jr. movie?
Awesome.
Right. Let's go.
What started merely as an experiment has brought me to the threshold of a monumental discovery. Now, if I play a chromatic scale, there's no measurable response.
You do know what you're drinking is meant for eye surgery.
But now, and this is remarkable, if I change to atonal clusters, voila. They fly in counterclockwise, synchronized concentric circles. As though a regimented flock. Otto, this is exceptional. I, using musical theory, have created order out of chaos.
How did you lure them in?
Excellent question. Individually, I've been at it for 6 hours.
And what happens if I do this?
Parallels this. From 1939. as Mrs. Watson just shakes her head. All right, so would the real Sherlock Holmes please stand up? The textual Sherlock Holmes is rather different than what the pop culture makes him out to be, and yet some of what is pop culture has turned out to be canon. The deerstalker cap and meerschaum pipe are now forever linked with Sherlock Holmes, but they're no longer absolutely necessary signifiers for the character. The Basil Rathbone series is indication as much. He's got a great coat. He doesn't have to wear the deerstalker cap. He's got a cell phone instead. But when you think about Sherlock Holmes, you'll always think of the Inverness pipe, or the Inverness cloak, and the deerstalker cap, and the meerschaum pipe. Now, of course, different portrayals take on the different characters have been canon at different points. Now, for my parents' generation and the World War II and baby boomer generation, Basil Rathbone, who we saw on that final clip, is the ultimate Sherlock Holmes. For my generation, Generation X, it would be Jeremy Brett, the gentleman at the beginning of our first clip. And for this new generation, it's Benedict Cumberbatch or Johnny Lee Miller or Robert Downey Jr. So everybody has their own idea of who is Sherlock Holmes. Just like everybody has a favorite James Bond or a favorite Doctor Who, everybody has a favorite Sherlock Holmes. So ultimately, it's about maintaining the connection to the spirit of the character and the creative universe, and that allows for a freshness of the stories. Adaptation, or looking at who is Sherlock Holmes, need not necessarily follow the letter of the stories. Same characters, different portrayals, new stories at 128 years after the initial publication and 116 years after the first film. This is the gift that keeps on giving. Sherlock Holmes will continue to be the hero that every generation needs. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much for your time. Any questions? I know I overwhelmed you with a ton of epic information. Go for it.
Hi. Thank you so much. This was amazing and impressive.
Well, thank you.
I know you work in the society, so the question is outside of this a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the fandom? The earliest fandom of Sherlock?
Well, the Baker Street Irregulars is the earliest fandom, so to speak. Now, how do I put this? There's kind of this war between the older generations and the younger generations over what constitutes a fan. So without inflaming the masses, what I can say is that in the 1930s, a bunch of people got together who were part of the publishing industry and decided that they wanted to have a dinner. And the topic of the dinner was Sherlock Holmes. And they had so much fun at this dinner that they decided to basically found a group called the Baker Street Irregulars and meet year after year. And slowly over the last 83 years, this literary society has basically spawned a bunch of offshoots or scion societies, including the younger Stamfords of Iowa City. Some of them are very serious, very scholarly. Some are a little bit more fun. Some will do cosplay. Some are generalist, which means anybody at any level can be a member. Some are very elite. I belong to 13 different groups, some at the very elite realm, some at the more generalist realm. Over on the tables, I have my own dressing gown and my own deerstalker, or my own Inverness cloak, as well as my own Burgess hats, like the one Jeremy Brett wore. And of course, I have about 4 different deerstalkers. So even though I don't do cosplay is not my thing, I obviously have enough of it, to constitute a pretty good collection for costuming. But I've written some toasts, which are a Sherlock Holmes tradition. A toast to a character like young Stanford, or to Dr. Watson, or to Dr. Watson's second wife. So in terms of the concept of fandoms, of people being enthusiasts, I prefer using the term enthusiast just because it's it encapsulates kind of what I do a little bit better. Fandom is basically accessible for everybody, but I think I take my scholarship kind of to a slightly higher level than your average, just kind of cursory on the side fan. So for me, it's kind of an obsession. Now that doesn't make me better or worse than anybody else. I love fans. Fans are my favorite people. Fans are the people that keep things going. So fans are wonderful and great, and not everybody has to be that scholar. Not everybody has to be engaged on the same level that I am. I love everybody, and everybody belongs in this community. But it goes back to the 1930s. Now, without getting into ridiculous amounts of detail. If you've ever heard of Dorothy Parker, the Great Wit Assist, and the Algonquin Round Table, the Baker Street Irregulars kind of is an unofficial offshoot of that. So we're talking kind of the New York elite in terms of the publishing industry. So it does have its origins in, shall we say, a little bit more upper crust society playboy, kind of rich origins, but it's become significantly more egalitarian. Now, historically, some of the more elite groups were gender segregated, and there are still a few gender segregated groups in America and throughout the world, but most, including the Baker Street Irregulars, have gone co-ed. So, the society is available to all now. Excellent question. Any other questions? Denny?
How many books, spin-off stories are there?
Oh my.
Is there a count?
Oh, countless, and there are more every day. I think an archive of our own, if we're talking strictly fan fiction, has over 93,000 entries, and that's just what's been published on the internet. If we're talking about books that have been published, stories that have been written about Sherlock Holmes, or focusing on Sherlock Holmes in terms of his techniques and tactics, we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands. Now there's been a recent copyright battle about Sherlock Holmes that it turns out that 50 of the original 60 stories are now in public domain, which then opens up the writing of stories to all, as long as you avoid details from those last 10 cases. So anything that's part of those last 10 cases, the Conan Doyle estate, if you write about, can sue you for. But if you avoid information that was exclusive to those 10 cases, it's free. So it was actually called the Free Sherlock Movement. Annotator and entertainment lawyer Leslie Klinger, who is a member of the BSI, or Baker Street Irregulars, was actually the legal mind behind the Free Sherlock Movement. And they really, the district court in Chicago clarified the copyright issue, I think probably about a year and a half ago now. So we're talking thousands and more. There's one of the earliest, shall we say, one of the earliest homages would be the 1899 William Gillette play that William Gillette, the American actor who I spoke of with the meerschaum pipe, he wrote in 1888 and published in 1899, and it became a worldwide sensation, which then spawned his own movie in 1916, an adaptation of the John Barrymore movie, also silent in 1922, and many iterations. So it's been basically, there's been writings about Sherlock Holmes since 1899 that weren't by the original author. So you've got 117 years of fan writing. A lot of fun. Good question, Denny. Any other questions? Go for it, David.
You come up with some biographical conjectures, which are interesting. I'm curious, who was it? William S. Baring Gould at this biography. I'm wondering if your conjecture differs dramatically
from Baring Gould. Okay, let me see if I can find this real quick. There was a very famous story that David is referencing called Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street by William S. Baring Gould. Baring Gould was one of the members of the Baker Street Irregulars, and he was very famous for writing an annotated version of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It was one of the original annotated versions. He also wrote this book, Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, in which he basically creates a backstory for Sherlock Holmes. It's not canon. It's, to use the modern phrase, it's fanon, but it's really fun and really good fanon. Although there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with. In the BBC Sherlock, they mentioned that Sherlock's full name is William Randolph Sherlock Scott Holmes, which comes directly from this story. So even within the BBC series, they're pulling from other from pastiches or homages or fan works. Now, in terms of the biographical information that I presented in my presentation, that all comes from clues that were within the original stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle. So there's nothing that I pulled from William S. Baring-Gould. Although it is generally agreed upon by Baring-Gould, as well as the Sherlockian community, that Sherlock Holmes' birthday, because of a reference to Twelfth Night, was on Three Kings Day, which would be January 6th. And then they were able to basically track back, based on other contextual clues, what year Sherlock Holmes was born. So even though Doyle didn't necessarily get very specific, because we all know what Harry Potter's birthday is, and what year, in fact, because J.K. Rowling's pretty, I was going to say, pretty open about details like that. Arthur Conan Doyle, not so much, but contextually we were able to understand them. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Sure.
Are there any portrayals or demographics, natures, or sightings of Holmes you'd like to see but haven't seen yet?
It's really interesting. I happen to be friends with a couple of people, actually quite a few people within the community itself, some of whom are doing some really exciting web series. There is a series that was an unfortunately failed Kickstarter, but I think they might be attempting it again, for Herlock, a all-female driven Sherlock Holmes adaptation. It's driven by this gentleman by the name of Lee Shackelford, who is most famous for writing the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Ship in a Bottle, which features Sherlock Holmes in the holodeck and Moriarty in the holodeck. He wrote the original draft. He's a really, really nice guy, and actually very pro-feminist. Yay. So I mean, there is that. Now, for me, as a bit of a purist, I love my Sherlock Holmes in the Sherlock Holmes that I find in the pages of the story. Every Sherlock Holmes that I presented tonight is a derivative, and that that female take of Sherlock Holmes would be a derivative of the original Sherlock Holmes that is found in the literature. That doesn't mean that they're inferior. That just means that they're different. And I have a lot of love for every single one of them. All the way from Basil Rathbone to Matthew Frewer, who is largely considered to be the worst portrayer of Sherlock Holmes ever. The guy who played Max Headroom, it's terrible, but I still have some love for that series of movies because it has a different and fresh take on the role. As far as things that I'd like to see, I don't know. My imagination kind of goes back to the idea of Sherlock Holmes in that swirling fog, kind of where it's always 1895. So, my imagination doesn't necessarily go too far from, or doesn't venture too far from that. I was, as I said, very impressed with the cartoon adaptation Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century, where they took a futuristic or kind of bend on the stories. I love this all. What's really fun is that you even have authors like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The NBA's highest scorer wrote a Sherlock Holmes story, or rather a Mycroft Holmes story, about Sherlock Holmes's older, wiser brother who was in charge of the British government. It's fantastic. Go for it, Denny. And they are adapting it into a comic book, which means I might, hopefully. I was going to say, or I'm planning on going every year, the Baker Street Irregulars, as well as a bunch of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts from all around the world, go to celebrate Sherlock Holmes' birthday. They've been doing this since 1934. There's only one event that is invitation only, which is called the BSI, or the Baker Street Irregulars Dinner. I was going to say, there's a lot of, I've been to the events the last 3 years running. I'll be going to the events hopefully in perpetuity. Someday, perhaps, if I am lucky, I will garner a dinner invitation, but I'm hoping that maybe Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will be in New York again promoting his new comic, and that I might get him to sign one of my books, which would be really cool. Any other questions? Go for it.
There's quite a few film adaptations tonight, and if it were up to you, what would be some of the basic ones that everyone can?
Okay, well, I mean, again, it really depends on what you're looking for with your Sherlock Holmes. It's an excellent question, by the way. My favorite, as I said, is the Jeremy Brett series, because, or the Granada series. So that appeared from 1984 to 1994. And that's the one that I grew up with. That's the one that sparked my imagination when I read the stories and I saw Jeremy Brett on TV for the first time. It was like, wow. My heart stopped, my jaw dropped. It was insane. I think my parents remember that day because I think that was the day that they considered committing me. But 11-year-old girl suddenly obsessed with this guy in Victorian garb on PBS. I can imagine what was going through my parents' head at that time. But that series is probably the best adapted series, especially in the early years of the series. As Jeremy Brett got older, his health deteriorated as well as his mental health, and they had to make some concessions in terms of the fidelity. Now, it is the show that has the highest fidelity, but and because of that, in some ways, it's dry in terms of its pacing and tone. So it's not as rip-roaring adventure as we'd kind of like. So I really like the Benedict Cumberbatch series, even though there are quite a few faults with it that I have. There's faults with everything, but there's still a lot of love. In the first couple of series, they do a really good job adapting in the spirit of the stories. You can definitely tell that the head writers, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, have a lot of love for the original Sherlock Holmes stories and are really trying to keep with the spirit of the show. I really like the Basil Rathbone series, of course, which there are quite a few fans of in the audience tonight. They're great, but when you think about it, you think of Sherlock Holmes kind of trapped in the Victorian London, and there are 2 Sherlock Holmes stories starring Basil Rathbone that are period set, but the rest of them are modern set in the 1940s. You have Sherlock Holmes versus the Nazis. So clearly this is modern set. It's basically the 1940s version of the Benedict Cumberbatch series, just set in the 1940s. So it really is a modern adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, or kind of a contemporary one. Now, one that a lot of people don't see in America is a series by Douglas Wilmer, who passed away earlier this year. Douglas Wilmer, not only was he a great actor who played Sherlock Holmes in a series in the 1960s in England, but he was also a Sherlock Holmes enthusiast. He was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And if you watch one of the episodes where Benedict Cumberbatch's Holmes in the BBC series is in the Diogenes Club, there's a doddering old guy who is upset. He's wearing a bow tie with a blue, a purple, and a gray stripe. So the blue, purple, and gray stripe bow tie, that's the official colors and color scheme of the Baker Street Irregulars. He is wearing his investiture tie because he was that proud of being a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. This fandom runs deep. Basil Rathbone, the actor, was not a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, but what he was a member of was the Hounds of the Baskerville in Chicago, founded in 1943. He was good friends with the founder, Vincent Sterrett, and actually did appear at some of the dinners. I am very, very lucky to also be a member of the Hounds of the Baskerville. It's one of those invitation-only Sherlockian groups. But I was invested or brought into membership actually in October of this past year. So it's quite an honor to be not only among the Sherlockian greats like Basil Rathbone, but also T.S. Eliot was a member. Part of it is kind of the, I appreciate the history, and I appreciate that I am in the company of giants, and that's not lost on me. Now again, not everybody has to be at this level of enthusiasm, not everybody has to be at this level of involvement. This is just the passion of mine since I was 11 years old and I'm a kid in a candy store, because I finally have the means to be able to go to these different events and hang out and basically just kind of hang out and talk about Sherlock Holmes with a bunch of people. Any other questions? Sir?
Maybe you've already made this clear, but why do you connect so much with this world and this character? What's your take on that?
Oh, excellent question. And I was going to say that goes back to my own particular Sherlock Holmes origin story. It's a very long story, so I'll do my best to give you the really short version. When I was 5 years old, growing up in rural Wisconsin, there weren't a lot of books. I wasn't an avid reader. And one day, my parents plunked me down on the couch and put a copy of The Mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, which is the children's edition of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It had The Blue Carbuncle, The Red-Headed League, and The Speckled Band, which are considered to be fan favorites, so to speak, the most accessible stories. So I read that book. That's the first book that I remember reading. and actually enjoying and not wanting to like throw it away, or one that stories that captured my imagination. Then I saw that movie where that guy in that deerstalker cap that they described in the books showed up on screen. And then that image stuck with me. And then 6 years later, when I was flipping through channels and I saw on A&E, back in the day when it was cable's PBS, Jeremy Brett, boom, instant. I saw the show. I couldn't get enough of it because I was like, this is a world so different than mine. Removed by 100 years and a continent. This idea of adventure. Growing up in rural Wisconsin, you don't exactly get a lot of that. You get cow tipping, and hanging out in the cornfields. So it really captured my imagination. And then, in all honesty, my gateway drug was Jeremy Brett, so to speak, and his portrayal of Sherlock Holmes, because I loved that series. When in the final problem, which I hadn't read the stories at that point, when I saw Jeremy Brett and Sherlock Holmes go off the Reichenbach Falls and die, plummeting to his death, or so I thought. 120-some-year-old spoilers. I cried. I was inconsolable because I had finally found this character that I liked, and how dare they kill him off? And then the following week, yay, he's back. They resurrected him. So I begged, and so I was glued to the television, and I begged my parents, and begged, get me the Sherlock Holmes stories. I mean, there's books. I need to read more of these. And I didn't realize that there were more than just that 3 that I had in that that children's edition. And so for Christmas in 1992, my Aunt Kathy, bless her, got me a copy of the Doubleday, which is an edition by BSI founder Christopher Morley's publication, Doubleday, that featured a preface talking about the Baker Street Irregulars and talking about how every year they get together and that they have these dinners. Unbeknownst to me, this also happened to be the first year that they invited women, which was 1991. Sorry, let me take that back. They invited women in 91. It was the year after that I was reading it. So they had allowed my gender for only 1 year by the time that I'm reading this preface. And 11-year-old Monica said, someday I want to be a part of this. This sounds so neat and so cool for people to get together and celebrate a series of books about camaraderie, about friendship, about adventure, about a character who has flaws, but is brilliant. So that idea of a community got together. And then, of course, as I got older, there was the internet, connecting with people on the internet. And I actually ended up going to a conference. I used to live in Minneapolis, and one of the biggest regrets of my life was never connecting with the group up there when I was living up there. But when I moved back, I was up in Minneapolis for a weekend visiting a friend, and I read in the paper about this conference that they were having at the University of Minnesota. So on a lark, I walked in. I sat down and I was chatting with this guy. Turns out he's the secretary of the Baker Street Irregulars, Peter Blau. I had no idea who he was. Probably one of the most important people in the community. I just happened to randomly sit down next to. And we were talking, and I was lamenting that there's no Sherlock Holmes group in Iowa City, Iowa, or Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And he points and he says, you see that guy over there? I said, yeah. He says, that's Richard Kaplan. He runs the younger Stanfords of Iowa City. You need to go talk to him. And lo and behold, I did. And within a month, I had joined the younger Stanfords. And 3 years later, Dick, after founding the group in '88, he decided to step down in 2013. And I decided to carry the banner. And my mission was to understand not only locally how to run a group and to keep Dick's legacy going, but to engage in the community and understand the depths of this community, because there is a lot of history here. There are a lot of members who have done great things. Isaac Asimov was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. FDR was an honorary member, as was President Truman. I mean, there are some very famous and great people and some prolific authors, including August Derleth, who did the Solar Pond series, that are part of this. And the whole idea of connecting with this community and being part of the legacy was very appealing to me, and in many ways still is. I have to admit, a little thrill goes through me when I hang out with my friend Bonnie. Bonnie and I were at a conference in Baltimore last month. Bonnie wrote the screenplay for a little-known science fiction movie called Tron. As I say, for some of the older people in the audience, that's resonating. Released in 1982. A sequel in 2010. Yeah, she wrote the original screenplay. I mean, I'm hanging out with famous people, but it doesn't matter. Now, one of the, I have to admit, one of the coolest things, since this is Super Hulock Week, is Curtis Armstrong, who plays the Metatron on Supernatural. He's one of us. Oh, by the way, he's wearing his BSI tie. Blue stripe, purple stripe, gray stripe. So Curtis is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. He's not a member because he's famous. He's a member because he's been a Sherlock Holmes enthusiast since 1969. My friend Susan Rice, when she was his teacher, brought him into the community when he was a teenager, before he was famous. The thing is that this is a fandom, this is an enthusiasm that runs deep. It's a lifelong pursuit, and you make lifelong friends. In the last 6 years of engaging in this community, I've met so many cool people, many of whom that I anticipate being friends with for decades to come. So it's just really cool for me. Excellent question. Sorry if I rambled on a little bit. That's the short version of the story, by the way.
You still own that book?
Oh, sorry?
Do you still own the original children's?
Oh, absolutely. It has a place of honor on my bookshelf, although it is tattered and beat up, and it's had to have its binding fixed. My original copies of the Doubleday are worse for wear and have notations throughout all of them. I'm going to have one of my friends repair the bindings because they are in pretty paltry and pathetic shape. But one of the bonuses of being a Sherlockian is that everybody buys you Sherlock Holmes books. And so I have at least 7 different editions of the complete Sherlock Holmes stories. And then, as you can see from the quantity of things on the table, there's writings about the writings. Never has so much been written about so few by so many. That's the cool thing, though, is that, as I said, this is the gift that keeps on giving. There's books about Sherlock Holmes as a fictional meeting with Sigmund Freud, written by University of Iowa's own Nicholas Meyer. There's a collection of essays, one fixed point in a changing age. This is a collection of essays that were collected on the internet by the Baker Street Babes, a Sherlock Holmes, or female Sherlock Holmes collective on the internet. So I mean, this is modern scholarship. But one of my favorites, we'll grab a couple of these. There we go, because we can. Okay, so a couple of my favorites. We've got Sherlock Holmes for Dummies. This is legit, by the way, and I have to admit it's come in handy quite a few times. Thank you, Stephen Doyle, who is, I am very fortunate to call a friend. There's also classic scholarship. This is a bound book called 221 Studies in Sherlock Holmes, but it's got a lot of stories, or shall we say scholarship, by Christopher Morley, founder of the Baker Street Irregulars. It's got Vincent Sterrett, who was a great and prolific journalist for the Chicago Tribune, founder of the Hounds of the Baskerville. It has Edgar W. Smith. I mean, it's got some pretty heavy hitters when it comes to literature. Now, the best part about this, as I said, is scholarship, because I'm a nerd and I dig me some scholarship. So the Baker Street Journal, yes, there is a quarterly Sherlock Holmes journal in America that has been published since 1946. We have 70 years quarterly issues of scholarship. Oh, and the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, which was founded in 1968 because the BSI didn't allow women. So the ladies said, forget you boys, we're going to start our own group. Both groups have subsequently gone co-ed, has the Serpentine Muse, which is also a quarterly periodical that features scholarship. The Baker Street Journal tends to be a little bit more scholarly and academic. The Serpentine Muse tends to be a little bit more whimsical. The Sherlock Holmes Society of London has the Sherlock Holmes Journal. There's Canadian Holmes, which is fantastic. And I do have to admit, and I'm going to throw this out there just because it's fun, my Sherlock Holmes tattoo which does appear on my back. My Sherlock Holmes tattoo does appear in the most recent issue of Canadian Holmes. Because they decided, since Sherlock Holmes in the story, The Red-Headed League, comments about one of the characters, this guy Jabez Wilson, that he has a tattoo, and therefore he can identify that Jabez spent some time in China. Somebody decided, well, I'm going to do an article about Sherlockians who have ink, or Sherlock Holmes ink. And so my recently acquired tattoo, which I just got about 3 months ago, featured in the article. There's a lot of people who do things like this. Usually they're 2-to-1 Bs and other variations. But so there's Canadian Holmes. There's, as I said, lots of scholarship, lots of publishing opportunities, lots of opportunities to write and get out there. Go for it, Denny.
What are the big holdings of archives in America?
Okay, well, excellent question. Now, one of the wonderful things about being in Iowa is that we are not far from anywhere, at least in the Midwest. We're 4 hours away from, from other major cities. Now, here in Iowa City at the University of Iowa, they have in the special collections writings by Nicholas Meyer, who is a pretty famous Hollywood director and screenwriter. He wrote The 7% Solution while he was here in the Writer's Workshop in 1974. The original manuscript of that, and I believe the original screenplay, is housed here, as well as a few letters by Arthur Conan Doyle are housed here at the University Special Collections. But 4.5 hours to the north is the greatest treasure trove of all time. The University of Minnesota, in their special collections, houses the world's largest collection of Sherlock Holmes items, 65,000 items plus. We're talking some original Beaton's Christmas annuals, so the original incarnation of the first publication of Sherlock Holmes. Pages from the Hound of the Baskervilles manuscript, original pages. I mean, some of these things are worth a couple $100,000 that I get to play with because, yay, because they're archived. They have games, they have deerstalkers, they have the giant rat of Sumatra stuffed animals, they have plushies. They have a little bit of everything in their collection, and it's housed 85 feet down in the bedrock of the Mississippi in their state-of-the-art archive. So that's, those are the two, I was going to say, the other archive is the BSI archive. The Baker Street Irregulars has its own archive at Harvard University. And so there's, it's really cool. I have not been to the Harvard archive yet. Someday I will make my journey to Harvard to go check out the history of my illustrious enthusiast and literary society. Toronto has a huge collection. I've actually recently been invited to write an article for the Friends of the Toronto collection, as well as the Friends of the Minnesota collection. As I say, I'm reveling in the idea that I get to write for these people. There's also a really great collection in London and then in Portsmouth in England as well. There's a few other smaller archives throughout the world, but as I said, the granddaddy of them all is at the University of Minnesota. And if you want to take a tour of the archive, which is fantastic, I have the ability to contact the curator, who is a friend of mine, Tim Johnson, a heck of a nice fellow who will be more than happy to probably give you guys a basic tour, although he won't take you to where all the really expensive stuff is, because that's kind of for archivists' eyes only, so to speak. Excellent question, Denny. Any other questions? Sir.
You mentioned, and of course it's legendary, about the miscontinuities in the various stories that were published over the course of the several years, dozens of years. What do you think would be happening to organizations like the BSI had Doyle paid more attention to continuity, and we knew exactly how many Marys Watson married and where his wound was?
Oh yes. Well, it would completely, I was going to say, completely mess up the fun scholarship. Part of the fun of playing the game is the fact that there's all these details that are missing and there's these inconsistencies. And so we get to argue about all these fun things. No, I think Watson had one wife. Well, I think Watson had two. I think Watson had three. I think he had six. We can have fun conversations for hours, kind of chewing on the minutia of this. So I think the concept is, if Doyle were a little bit more consistent of an author, there wouldn't be nearly as much fun for us 128 years years later. But I still think that there's enough depth and breadth within the stories themselves that would spark this, a pretty significant degree of scholarship. Maybe not quite from the level of analyzing the inconsistencies to death and trying to find a new angle in something that hasn't been done in 120 something years of scholarship, in all honesty, it's kind of daunting trying to find an original spin on some work. It still can be done, but it means that you have to rack your brain and be a little creative because there's been that much scholarship analyzing these 60 stories, from every possible angle. But I think that there still would be scholarship, there still would be a lot of fun, but I think maybe not quite as much fun. So in many ways, I'm very thankful that Doyle, over the course of 40 years, really didn't keep track of all the details, because that's where I have my most fun. I had a question back here.
Suppose maybe you did that on purpose.
Actually, no. I wish I could play it off at the fact that Doyle intended to do this on purpose. It's mostly because, as much as I hate to say it, Doyle didn't care as much. Now, Doyle, in the first couple of stories, he was a doctor, and he didn't exactly have a very thriving medical practice. So he filled his time by, writing these stories, and sold one, and it did measurably successful in the publication, and then he wasn't going to write another, and then there's this legend that he was at a dinner, and I'm going to slaughter this so terribly, so my Sherlockian friends who might be watching this, please forgive me. But there's, I was going to say, there's kind of this tale about Doyle being at a dinner with an American publisher, along with Oscar Wilde, who I mentioned earlier in my talk. So Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle are at this dinner with this American publisher, and they're having this conversation. And the American publisher says, well, I really like that Sherlock Holmes story, but I think you should write another. I challenge you to write another. Doyle took him up on the offer. And at that same dinner, the American publisher says to Wilde, well, you should write another story too. What came out of that was Dorian Gray. So, under the circumstances, you've got these two contemporaries taking two very different tracks in terms of how they're engaging in literature. Basically, two masterpieces, The Sign of Four and the rest of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and Dorian Gray, all sprang from a bet by an American publisher. So I know I'm completely slaughtering the telling of that tale, but I find it majestic that kind of how everything just kind of synergized and came together in order to create these stories. It's wonderful. But I love this stuff. Hopefully that answers your questions. Sir?
When did Doyle stop seeing himself as a doctor for his own?
Probably about the time that, well, actually that's a good question. I'm less of a Doylean, because there's Sherlockians, so Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts like me, people who love the Sherlock Holmes stories and follow the Sherlock Holmes stories. And then there's Doyleans, which are people who follow the life of Arthur Conan Doyle, which in some ways encapsulates Sherlock Holmes, but also all of his other writings and his spiritualism and the work with the fairies and his work with the British government and for propaganda, etc. So I'm not much of a Doylean, so I'm gonna own that straight up. But my basic understanding of when Arthur Conan Doyle stopped really seeing of himself as a doctor is about the time that he quit writing the Sherlock Holmes stories the first time. So basically from 1887 to 1893, he was writing stories pretty much full time because the public couldn't get enough of these. So given the circumstances, Doyle kind of became a full-time writer. And then one of the reasons why he killed off Holmes is because he didn't want to be seen as the author of the pulpy, kind of populist, trashy novels, so to speak. He wanted to be seen as someone who was important, someone who was writing great works like The Boer War or The White Company. And Doyle wanted to be seen as a serious author, not the guy who's writing penny dreadfuls. And so he basically he killed off his cash cow. And then, of course, spent a decade, living it down and being harassed by the fans and harassed by people and kind of chided and jibed. Now, I mean, it wasn't quite the level of harassment that we see today, like, in terms of internet, bashing and, people stalking other people. But Doyle did definitely get an earful from a lot of people over the next decade until he brought Holmes back. So as far as when he stopped really seeing himself as a doctor, I'm not entirely sure, but he didn't exactly really focus on making his medical practice very thriving from 1893 onward. Any other questions?
I think we are just about out of time because the library will be closed.
Oh, thank you.
So, thank you, Monica. Thanks
you
for coming in.
Thank you for your kind attention. Oop. All right. Yay. All the fun things. Oh yes, and by the way, if anybody has any interest in joining the younger Stamfords or learning more about the younger Stamfords, I have business cards. We have a website. We have email address. We have contact information. You are most welcome to grab and attend. Thanks.